today's World Insight, light at the end of the lockdown tunnel for Wuhan with restored rail and land links. Experts allay fears of a viral resurgence.
Thus, the people's health and safety is the first. So I suppose the decision is correct.
And the race against the clock for a proven COVID-19 vaccine, seen as a panacea against the pandemic. How long before the world gets one? Direct answers from the International Vaccine Institute head.
12 to 18 months has been the estimate.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight on CGTN from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. We dedicated today's program to the lift of lockdown in the city of Wuhan. After 76 days in lockdown, the city is picking up the pieces and moving on to a new chapter. It proved that strong containment measures work in controlling COVID-19 spread. And a new study published in the journal Science says the lockdown bought time for over half of China. Combined with other control measures, it prevented hundreds of thousands of infections. It helped to curb the cases during the first 50 days of the outbreak by 96%. Wuhan's lockdown happened 3 days after Dr. Zhong Nanshan visited the city and confirmed human-to-human transmission on January the 20th. Earlier, I talked to Dr. Zhong, who's the head of the high-level expert team of China's National Health Commission. Let's listen in to his own account of what the days are like leading to the lockdown and how effective it was. You were in Wuhan on January the 18th evening, if I understand right, together with some of the other experts invited by the Health Commission.
Yeah.
Then you went with some of them to different places in Wuhan. The market,
Yes.
a hospital, Jinyantan, and also the Wuhan CDC. And then you guys had a discussion in the afternoon, if I understand, on the 19th, about what to propose and whom to propose to. So what was exactly the nature of that discussion on the 19th January afternoon? At that time, were possibility of human-to-human transmission being discussed? And who did you say things about that to, Professor?
I just asked some questions. One, how exactly how many patients are there in Wuhan being infected? And the second, whether they had some patient dying. And the third, whether they have medical staff being infected.
And then you talk about human-to-human transmission on the 20th in an interview with CCTV, if I remember right, Professor. But before that, did you talk to the policymakers about human-to-human transmission possibilities?
Yes, yes, I think so.
Okay.
So in the morning of the 20th January, so I have a meeting with our VIP person, and I talk with that. I think that once the human-to-human transmission happened, that will be a very serious situation, serious disease.
Okay.
I'm glad our governor and the VIP, they accept that.
Professor Zhong, another important question
And
is...
then subsequent, they had taken some very strong action.
Talking about strong action, Professor Zhong, the lockdown of the city of Wuhan, that was beginning to be implemented on the 23rd of January. Now, who proposed the lockdown of Wuhan? You or somebody else, or collectively?
Yeah.
And whom do you propose that to?
I think...
what time did you propose it?
Well, I haven't discussed with my group because I'm the head of this expert committee group. So haven't discussed with them. So most of us agree with that. So we should set up a policy of not down Wuhan. I mentioned about the principle is don't go to Wuhan and don't leave Wuhan. So that's what my subjection.
So it is a collective proposal, if I understand right, you just said. Is that?
Of course, of course. After two months of practice, it's like totally correct. So in this way, I remember, I think so the President Xi Jinping, he mentioned one word which impressed me very much. He said we should take the people's health and safety to the first priority. So in other words, this kind of action will make some, of course, great impact of economy. However, the leader said, the people's health and safe is the first. So I suppose the decision is correct.
Professor Zhong, if you were asked by, let's just say, your colleagues in Italy, your colleagues in New York, your colleagues in California, and your colleagues possibly in some of the Asian countries, what would you suggest to them? Will the China way, as you earlier pointed out, since the 23rd of January, be able to work for them?
I think principally, I think it should be. So because they are, at the moment, all the foreign countries like in Europe or as well as in United States, they have set up this kind of policy. So they call that the lockdown, the cities or some others. But exactly, so not down a city is not useful. So you block the change, the communication between the cities and other cities is not new. It's not the main point. So you have to so I just now mentioned about so keep distancing. So people, if inside the city, as I heard from some of the foreign countries, said, well, we lock down the city, and then inside the city, people just, in particular young people, just join together, attending parties or some banquet or meeting, and it doesn't work. It's not locked down. So we lock down, the concept will be going to the community setting. So keep at home and to avoid to contact other people and not attending the meeting and not attending the banquet. That's very important.
Professor Zhong, during SARS, you are the one standing up and say, now, there's something wrong. We need to correct this. And this time, again, you are the one of the early ones among all the experts to speak out and speak out with a strong impact. And how would you be able to propose in a way that you think policymakers would accept for the benefits of the common good, Professor Zhong?
As you know, the events of coronavirus infection actually happened 3 times in this century. So the first time is SARS in the year 2003. And the second time is MERS in 2012. And then this is the 3rd time. As compared with the last 2 events, this kind of disease is more infectious. I mean, more has a higher infectivity. So although, I mean, the mortality is not as high as the SARS and MERS. So this is something, as a doctor or clinician, I respect the fact.
My earlier interview with Dr. Zhong Nanshan. Many Chinese cities, as well as those in hard-hit nations, such as Italy and Spain, have also taken strong containment measures, but the situation varies from region to region. So how do policymakers decide when to carry out a lockdown or shut down borders? And as the lockdown in Wuhan is now lifted and daily life returns to a normal, many people are wondering, what about the Wuhan residents' level of so-called herd immunity? Earlier, I had an in-depth interview about that question and many more with Professor Zhang Wenhong, who is the head of the Center for Infectious Diseases at Huashan Hospital of Fudan University in Shanghai. He's also leading Shanghai's work against COVID-19. Take a listen. Professor Zhang, one of the things people have been asking especially from outside China, what exactly are the Chinese ways, or is the Chinese way? But many of us who are here in this country know there's no just one single Chinese way of dealing with COVID-19, but various practices. How would you compare, for example, where you are, Shanghai, with the city of Wuhan?
其实中国的经验，并不是说中国的经验可以，完全可以复制到全世界。
In fact, China's experience cannot be replicated. Take Wuhan and Shanghai, for instance. Both cities are in China, but they have different circumstances.
方式完全是不同的。我们武汉采取的就是 lockdown。为什么要 lockdown？lockdown 就是说这是整个中国的 epicenter。
The lockdown of Wuhan was because it was the center of the outbreak, and there were a large number of cases exported. Therefore, the complete closure of the city at the time would play a very effective role in the national epidemic control, and it would have a great significance for China and the world. This greatly reduced the number of imported cases in Shanghai. After the import ratio has been greatly reduced, Shanghai's prevention and control does not require a lockdown.
上海的防控就不是 lockdown， 我们是 slow down， 甚至于 shut down 都谈不上。
The measures at the time in Shanghai were a slowdown, not even a shutdown. So what does a slowdown mean? We just slowed down the pace of life.
尽量的 stay at home， 尽量的待在家里。
We suggested people stay at home as much as possible, wear masks when going out, wash hands frequently, and maintain social distance. Some entertainment and leisure places, such as restaurants, temporarily closed, but supermarkets, hospitals, banks, and other essential businesses remained open.
公共的交通给限制掉了，所以在这种情况下面，对于一个城市的 slow down，
We only restrict public transportation. So in this case, this can slow down a place where the number of cases is not very big, and the local economy and people's lives are not greatly affected. This is somewhat similar to the current epidemic prevention methods adopted by Hong Kong, Singapore, and other places. It blocks the import-type ratio. People's daily grind slows down. If the epidemic flares up, it may have to transition to a shutdown. If it becomes an epidemic center, it may require a lockdown.
成为一个 epicenter， 我们可能就需要 lockdown。
So, Professor Zhang, what you said is extremely interesting to me because there's one ultimate question that is, how would you judge as to what approach to take?
事实上呢，就是我们在疫情的一个发展过程当中。
In fact, there will be some clues during the development of the epidemic. From the perspective of a city like Shanghai, the first phase in the development of the epidemic is imported cases.
如果 imported cases， 我们也就是输入性的一个病例。
At this time, if you can effectively prevent and control imported cases, it will be very successful. However, there may be negligence in the process of this phase. This negligence means that you have guarded the gate, but the small door is unguarded. Like the United States, China was blocked, but it did not notice the cases from European countries. Then came the second phase, and the outbreak in the U.S. suddenly boomed. At this point, the second phase of the outbreak is imminent.
我们给你一个提示，我们得升级，我们得 upgrade， 我们得。
A stricter prevention and control strategy than before is necessary. It is also very difficult.
我们要对所有的 imported cases 进行 tracing， 我们进行追踪。你如果追踪得到
Because we need to track all imported cases. If it cannot be traced, the epidemic will spread further in the community, or even spread among communities.
另外一个小区里面。
The number of cases will climb slowly at the early stage, and more cases will be difficult to trace later.
到越来越多的它的 cases 你找不到，这个时候我们对整个城市采取的策略就是逐渐的从 slow down 要过渡到 shut down。所以现在
At this time, our strategy for the entire city is to gradually transition from slowdown to shutdown. I believe that experts from various countries will take corresponding measures according to the situation of their own countries.
我相信各个国家的流行病学专家也根据自己国家的一个情况，会采取相应的 response。
Wuhan has been locked down for quite some time.
Yes.
After a city which is the epicenter
Yes.
with the cases percentage so high and death rate reaching certain extent, what would that mean when people there have been locked down for quite some time. Would the people as a group develop certain kinds of immunity among themselves compared to the other parts of China, compared to the other parts of the world?
Yes, that's right. I think this is really a very crucial question, and I think maybe 1 month ago that Prime Minister from the United Kingdom, he mentioned about the herd immunity. Is that right? Actually, if a city or a country have the herd immunity, really I think it will be a disaster for the population there. However, when emerging infectious disease, I think sometimes it cannot be speculated than we met before. However, I think in Wuhan and something similarly in Italy, we found that lots of patients were infected by the novel virus. And I think if a lot of population infected with this virus, actually they would acquire the immunity. So the herd immunity actually was forced to be set up. So therefore, I think in China, the only city that with the highest immunity, it would be Wuhan. So after a long time, I think the Wuhan may be the most safest city in China. So therefore, I think I can imagine that the Wuhan, lots of people actually they have the immunity already. However, I think this is a scientific question. We should do more study for that. Fortunately, some of my colleagues in Wuhan city, they have designed some study to do that. They can do the several epidemiology study for that. Maybe several weeks later, we can get the level of the antibody to the virus. So today, everything is still remain to be answered.
But then what does that mean for the rest of the country? And what does that mean for the rest of the world when we are interacting with people coming out of Wuhan, which is a city that had been locked down?
我们在评估这个事情。
We are evaluating this matter. Earlier, I discussed this issue with a German virologist. He had a long history of cooperation with Wuhan. He said that it is difficult for us to judge the degree of herd immunity. But he believes during this epidemic, people in Wuhan have become the most immune group in China. From his point of view, when we are in contact with Wuhan's people, we are in contact with a group of immune people.
他的免疫力最强的一个群体，所以在他看来。
I think that if Wuhan has no new COVID-19 infections, it has no local transmissions. This is the first point. The second point is that the population in this city has the highest immunity against COVID-19. Then the premise of these two scientific assumptions is established. I believe that proving this will be inevitable, and a conclusion should be reached soon.
本土的病例，这个是确切的。
My earlier conversation with Professor Zhang Wenhong. Though the lockdown in Wuhan has been lifted, epidemic control is far from over. Imported cases and asymptomatic cases are believed to be sources of uncertainty. So what is the key to preventing a resurgence? Earlier, I had a conversation with Professor Zeng Guang, the chief epidemiologist at the Chinese CDC. He says the lockdown is a group decision. He also allayed fears that lifting the lockdown may lead to a resurgence. Lockdown has come to an end, at least for the city of Wuhan. Among all the possibilities now for the next stage of control and prevention, which is the most crucial?
这科学发现跟这个疾病传播可能是两回事儿。
I think we ought to distinguish the difference between scientific studies and disease prevention measures. Let's take a look at how China reached its turning point in this outbreak. For us, the turning point emerged around February 5th. From there on, you see a clear downward trend of new cases.
从那儿开始往下走，你看它是一路这么走下来的。
So yes, there is the issue of transmission during the incubation period. There are asymptomatic infections, and we see news about recovered patients who test positive again. But none of these issues stopped the steady decline of new cases. The curve went down regardless. So by looking at the data, we can be certain that the outbreak is on the wane, despite some lingering uncertainties. For us epidemiologists, we don't feel scared.
Now we do not have lockdowns anymore. That was earlier, under the condition of lockdowns.
I think the situation is under control now, even without the lockdowns. When I explain to people why I'm not worried, I often use the Ebola outbreak in West Africa as an example. West Africa is not perfectly prepared for epidemic outbreak, but after they contained Ebola the first time, when Ebola broke out again, they were able to contain the epidemic very quickly. Why is that? What changed in West Africa after their first outbreak? The most important thing that changed is their monitoring ability. Monitoring is the key. Once you have the ability to spot the outbreak quickly, you can contain it. So for China, be it the new cases are imported or not, as long as we can monitor and identify them in a timely fashion, we have it under control. The vast majority of imported cases didn't result in secondary transmissions, or if more transmissions even took place. As long as we know exactly how the infections happen, we are entirely capable of controlling the spread of the virus.
There are other examples, they say, not only China's, but also that of Singapore, that of South Korea. Apparently, they all have some kind of control of the epidemic.
I think what we are seeing in places near China are somewhat expected. South Korea and Japan are our close neighbors, so they also acted relatively quickly. They took advantage of seeing what happened in China in the very beginning, so they skipped that initial painful discovery phase we had to go through. They took the chance and acted early on. So even if their measures are not particularly strict, they achieve some good results. But we should note that they are taking a different containment approach than us. Their measures have resulted in a state of low infection. It is a continuous state, but it is not stable. They have reached a state where their hospitals have the capacity to handle the cases. They have enough beds to receive new patients as old patients recover. The pressure is low. But it looks like the situation might be changing in Korea. They might be building their versions of temporary hospitals now. I think when the danger of an epidemic outbreak is approaching, we who are working in public health have a more acute sense of it. For most people in society, including government officials, it is not something that they normally think about. But what we need is that when they do come into contact with it, they become alert immediately. They believe what we say. I've been working in public health for 5 decades and have had my fair share of interacting with government officials. If governing was like playing a piano, then managing public health crisis is a key that they seldom hit.
Thank God.
In times like this, it is our job, public health advisors, to say to officials, it is time to hit that key. It is time to hit that key hard. You must do it now. If we don't pay great attention to public health safety, then the loss could be unprecedented.
Wuhan reopened transport link on Wednesday, marking a big turning point in the city's recovery. On Wednesday morning, roads were removed from highways. Traffic out of the city is expected to peak and then tail off over the coming week. Just today, some 276 trains are set to depart Wuhan, carrying about 55,000 passengers. All travelers will still be subject to a strict checking of mobile health codes and temperatures. The volume of travelers out of Wuhan is huge, and there will likely be more control measures to come. But with decisive actions and public cooperation, we see eventually the shed of the shackles of the pandemic. You're watching World Insight, still to come on our program. The race against the clock for a proven COVID-19 vaccine, seen as a panacea against the pandemic. How long before the world gets one? Direct answers from the International Vaccine Institute head right after this break.
12 to 18 months has been the estimate.
Well, Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. An efficient vaccine could be the magic bullet that would take a bite out of the COVID-19 pandemic. With the dire need to protect the big populations from the coronavirus, researchers are racing against time around the world to hurdle the steps in producing one. With many vaccine candidates in the making, it's the question on everybody's mind: when can the world finally have it? I got direct answers from Jeremy Kim, the head of the International Vaccine Institute. Let's listen in. Dr. Kim, tell me more about how long do we still have to wait until a vaccine for COVID-19 can be available?
That's a very important question, and one that a lot of people have been asking. Typically, usually, it takes between 5 and 10 years to develop a vaccine. But these are not usual circumstances. So scientists around the world are hoping that we are able to prove that a vaccine works in 12 to 18 months.
We understand that both in China and in the United States, there are already trials, clinical trials going on in terms of vaccines. So what can we expect? How much do we know about these vaccine candidates?
So we know correspondingly less than we would under normal circumstances, because really, I mean, China knew about this illness at the end of December, and the rest of us really learned a lot about it when Chinese scientists released all the information about the illness in the middle of January. So that the fact that we have vaccines under testing in humans in, I guess that would be 2 months, is really a remarkable achievement in vaccine development.
What are some of the priorities as a scientist that needs to look at during the process of clinical trial, just to make sure that will be the priority? Can you help us to understand some of the important points?
Yes. So I can actually talk a little bit about the questions that we don't know the answer to, because actually those will give you some insight. You know, we really believe, but we don't know for a fact, that people who've been infected once are protected against future infection. That's important because it means that, you know, if you were infected and your body has fought off the virus, if you are now protected, it means that the body makes responses that can protect people against the virus. That means that we hope a vaccine can do the same thing. So that's a really important proof. And actually, Chinese scientists have shown that in monkeys that are infected once are probably not able to be infected again. And that's an important proof of concept. The second very important thing that we need to know is we don't really know exactly what responses, what protective mechanisms the body has are the protective ones. We're going for what we believe to be the best. Antibody, these are infection-fighting proteins, and killer cells, which kill the virus that's in cells in the body. And we think that a balance of those two is really important. So we'd like to test that in an animal model. And in the animal model, we're going to look to see that if we give the vaccine and then challenge the animal, a mouse or a ferret or a monkey, with the virus, that the vaccine protects against infection. And that's actually where we can look for the first safety signal. Not only does it have to protect the animal, but it has to we have to make sure that the animal itself doesn't have some other effect from the challenge. And the final thing that we really need to know is, you know, it's fine to test things in animals, but as we move this into humans, what are we going to do? So in the initial test, you move a little slowly because you want to make sure that the vaccine doesn't cause any immediate reactions. And that's really important. As you increase the number of people, as you go from the first phase to the second phase to the third phase of human clinical testing, you gradually increase the number from, you know, roughly 50 to several hundred to usually several thousand. And all along, every 7 days, right after a vaccination, you call the volunteer and say, are you okay? Have you been having any problems? We watch people if they've gotten the vaccine and gotten infected, because again, we want to make sure that the vaccine isn't doing anything that is harmful to individuals. And then we have a longer term follow-up. So you get a vaccine, and sometimes you have to get a booster vaccine. We don't know that any vaccine that's given now, how long it will last. So we have to keep checking the people who received the first vaccines in order to see how long these supposedly protective responses will last. And is there any problem if the protective responses drop below a certain level? So the people who develop vaccines are always watching and continue to watch a volunteer in a vaccine trial.
Dr. Kim, since you talk about the 3 stages, usually how long the 3 stages would take under this circumstance that everybody is longing for a viable vaccine right now for COVID-19, what are likely to be the time frame for the 3 stages if things goes smoothly? That's a precondition.
Right. Right. If the vaccine passes all the preset criteria for moving forward, that's exactly right. We will hope to have information from the initial testing in 2 to 3 months, which will mean that the phase 2 study could start a little bit sooner than that before all the data are complete, but once we have information on safety. The phase 2 is really designed to look at the target population, the population that we would like to have vaccinated ultimately, and to make sure that it makes the right protective responses in enough people to be able to tell. That's why it's usually on the order of a couple of hundred. And then, often again, before the end of that, in this accelerated scenario, we might be able to start phase 3 of testing in a much larger population, but one in which we see the disease. So, for instance, some people are thinking maybe we should vaccinate doctors and nurses. Or maybe we should go to a country with a relatively high burden of disease now and vaccinate people who are not infected. Because in order for us to prove that the vaccine is protecting against infection, we actually have to give it to people who might, through the course of their daily lives, be exposed to virus and become infected. So we hope to start that one probably at the end of this year or early next year. And depending on how many infections or how serious the problem is, then in several months you might know whether the vaccine is actually working to protect against infection and disease. That's why I think 12 to 18 months has been the estimate that people would do.
It's not just China and some of the Western countries in Europe, North America now. The virus is in 200 countries, and also developing countries are likely to be the next group of countries suffer the most from COVID-19. So how to make the vaccine, once it is available, quickly manufactured and also with safety. Meanwhile, make it low cost or no cost to those population that in urgent need will be a gigantic task. We've been doing some of those tests earlier. You were also, and your organization, involved in some of those possibilities. But what about for the very urgent situation like this, when the vaccine is new, if we had one?
That's a really great question. And so organizations like CEPI have in their charter a need to make sure that the vaccines that are developed are available for use throughout the world. And remember that if we have to vaccinate a good part of the world's population, even half of 7 billion people, is 3.5 billion doses of vaccine. So no one company, even Johnson & Johnson committed to making 1 billion doses. 1 billion doses is not going to protect even the majority of people in this world. So I think that there's an understanding that there probably will need to be either more than one vaccine made by more than one company in large quantities, or there will need to be some mechanism to transfer the ability to manufacture these vaccines to a number of different companies around the world, each of which can produce millions and millions of doses. For instance, Indian and Chinese companies can easily produce tens of millions of doses of vaccines, which they do routinely. In the Chinese vaccines, most of them are approved by the regulatory authority in China. The same is true for Indian companies, and then they get a subsequent approval from the World Health Organization. That we call pre-qualification. Pre-qualification allows the vaccine to be purchased by UNICEF, for instance, United Nations organizations, and given to Gavi, which is the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. Gavi provides vaccines at low or no cost to the countries that can't afford it. So again, the world has mechanisms to distribute vaccine. And we're hoping that as we move forward, the companies and the organizations like CEPI and governments, like the government of China, the government of the United States, are going to realize that we together as a world have a lot at stake in making sure that everyone has access to effective vaccines.
Yeah, another question just to follow up, but who would get it first? Who would get it earlier than later? That's going to make a huge difference, and that's also going to lead to a lot of debates, if not fights. Dr. Kim, we saw many of these stories in movies, you know, about epidemics or pandemics. But many really wonder, in our lifetime, are we going to see some of those fights taking place right in front of our eyes as a result of vaccine? Go ahead, sir.
Yes, and absolutely that question, and then also to make sure that the vaccine that's being put out, you know, when people get desperate, there are going to be imitations and artificial products and things that are going to try to take money from people and not offer any protection at all. So we see that with medicines. So I think that the key here is we don't have a vaccine that's been shown to be protective against the disease. So the time to talk about prioritization of people within a country, of countries, is really now. We have to start that discussion now. And organizations like the World Health Organization and CEPI are going to be important from an international perspective at helping us to understand, you know, what's important. Will the United States insist that, you know, a vaccine that the U.S. government pays for be used in Americans first? Probably. The same would be true of China. Organizations like CEPI take funding from a lot of different countries. And so CEPI will have to have a different approach. We'll have to have an approach that is more cooperative, more collaborative, more the kind of thing where, you know, smaller countries, say, like Korea or Germany, which don't have the same capacity as China, the United States, or India, will have to really make a collective decision on how to protect people best. And really, the time to do it is now. Within a population, if you had the first 100,000 doses of vaccine, who would you vaccinate?
Yeah.
Would you vaccinate doctors and nurses? Because they're really critical for providing care up front and limiting the suffering from disease. Would you vaccinate politicians so that there's effective control over governments, policemen, ambulance drivers? I mean, those kinds of choices are the ones we should make before we have to make a decision. Because once we get close to the end, it's going to be more and more difficult to do things in a way that is systematic and rational.
Yeah. My final question, Dr. Kim. Earlier, we tried with coronavirus vaccine, but failed for various reasons. Do we have confidence, and how much, about some of the candidates that it's available right now, and possibly be the one that's likely to be used by all of us in the future? Dr. Kim.
So that's a great question, because we've had SARS, which is a coronavirus, the first one in the early 2000s. Then we had the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is another coronavirus. It hit Korea in 2015, but has been a problem in the Middle East since around 2011 or 2012. And we don't have vaccines against the other two. Well, in the first case, SARS, the first SARS actually kind of disappeared. And part of the issue with that SARS was that most people who were infectious were very symptomatic, so it was easy to identify them and isolate them. With MERS is not contagious, is not as contagious. So it doesn't spread as readily as the current version, as COVID-19 does in populations. So that makes it a lot easier to contain. It makes it actually more difficult to develop a vaccine against MERS, because it really occurs in tiny little outbreaks in hospitals or clusters of families in the Middle East, you know, where one of the people might have been exposed to a camel that was carrying the virus. With SARS, the fact that the disease disappeared made it impossible to take further vaccines forward. I think the issue with COVID is that the disease will probably be with us. I think everyone has heard the projections now that Asia will probably see a second or maybe even a third wave of infections. And so Asian governments will continue to be on guard. So I think we will have COVID, and that's the reason why a vaccine will probably be tested within the period of 12 to 18 months, and hopefully one of them will be shown to be effective. Why do I think that we might have a chance? I think that there's some evidence that people who've been infected once can't be infected again. The vaccines have been hardest to develop, vaccines against HIV, vaccines against tuberculosis or malaria. In those cases, the immune system's response to the, say, HIV or TB is not sufficient to clear the disease, to suppress the disease. With COVID-19, we've seen a lot of people who've recovered, and we believe that those people are going to be immune to future infections, and that would raise some hope that we should be able to develop a vaccine. The more important part, again, other than efficacy, is safety, and we absolutely have to make certain that any vaccine that we develop not only protects against the disease itself, but doesn't have any side effects that we hadn't anticipated, that we weren't planning for, that are going to surprise us, because we want vaccines to protect people and keep them healthy.
My interview with head of the International Vaccine Institute. The lockdown in Wuhan is now lifted on Wednesday, marking a hard-earned milestone in the global battle against COVID-19. But the pandemic is far from over. With sustained efforts, though, to contain the coronavirus, there's more challenges still ahead. And that will do for this edition of World Insight. To find out more, you can always find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.